Today we'll be talking about Chapter 2, Section 4. It's called The Settlement of the Middle Colonies. And so we'll be looking at several interesting colonies here, like Pennsylvania, for example. One of my favorite colonies to talk about. Now, let's start with New Netherland. New Netherland was founded by the Dutch. And I just think it's an interesting contrast to talk about New Netherland versus yesterday's lesson on the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Because it was founded by the Dutch. And the Dutch had established a large commercial empire called the West India Company. And this corporation had colonized New Netherland, which is today New York. And they invited people from all over. They said, we don't care who you are, what you believe, what you look like. You got 3 arms, you got 4, we don't care. Come on in. Because the purpose of New Netherland was to generate profit. And anybody who's there, who's working, who's generating profit, if you're working on the farms, if you're cutting wood, if you're hunting otters for pelt, awesome. Whatever you're doing, you're benefiting the colony. Come on in. And so Germans, French, Scandinavians, folks from Africa, from other European countries, they were just coming from all over. And guess what? The folks in New Netherland had friendly relations with the natives. Why? Because they weren't there to conquer. They were there to make money. And which is cheaper, business or war? Now, I've watched enough gangster movies to tell you that wars cost money, whether you're talking about nations or gangs or just businesses in general. Like this trade war business, it's expensive. It's much cheaper. It's much more beneficial for everyone if we all get along and we do business. And so that's why the Dutch maintained relatively friendly relations. In general, these settlers were more interested in making money than dominating territory. For example, one of the wealthiest commodities coming out of the New World were furs. Furs were considered a luxury item. They were the iPhones of their day. These hardcore mountaineers would travel for months at a time and not see another human. And they would hunt for beaver and otter. They would trap them, they would skin them, and then they would travel months back to these settlements like New Netherland. And they would trade these beaver and otter pelts. And they would make their way all the way back to Europe, and people would pay top dollar for coats made out of these furs, or for top hats made out of these furs. And once more, that was the must-have luxury item that was coming out of the New World. And so the Dutch were making a killing off of this stuff. Well, the English, they're who they are. The British were concerned with having the biggest empire in the whole wide world. And they saw New Netherland as a threat. They were like, look, we feel like we need to have a British flag in your city. The Dutch were like, really? Seriously, we're making money here, guys. I mean, we're not trying to take over anything. But the British, being who they were, they saw these neighbors as a threat. And eventually, the Duke of York became the owner of New Netherland. And of course, he named it New York. And the British got their way, and New York became one of the most popular British colonies. And then he gave part of the land to his friends, other aristocrats, powerful landholders, etc., and they named that part New Jersey.
Did you know that New York City was once called New Amsterdam? And it was ruled by another country, the Netherlands? But the Dutch weren't the only people to control the Big Apple. The English also controlled New York for more than a century. New York became part of the United States in 1776, when the 13 original colonies declared independence from Great Britain.
Landholders, etc., and they named that part New Jersey.
Did you know that New York City was once called New Amsterdam? And it was ruled by another country, the Netherlands? But the Dutch weren't the only people to control the Big Apple. The English also controlled New York for more than a century. New York became part of the United States in 1776, when the 13 original colonies declared independence from Great Britain. During the 1600s, the Dutch, French, and British empires were competing to claim new territories around the world. New territories meant quicker trade routes, strategic military forts, fur trade. But lawlessness and lack of leadership threatened to stop the flow of money back to the Netherlands. So, in 1626, the Dutch sent Director General Peter Minuit to New Netherland to lead the troubled colony. His first order of business was to put a stop to the fighting that was affecting the fur trade. In the process, Minuit may have made one of the best real estate deals in history. It is commonly thought that he bought Manhattan Island from the local Native Americans for a very small price. But the Native Americans misunderstood the agreement. They thought it was an agreement to share the land, not to give it up. The purchase led to the establishment of the city of New Amsterdam, at the southern tip of Manhattan Island. Dutch colonists began spreading into other areas throughout the region. Some moved to Long Island. Others went north to Fort Orange, which is present-day Albany. New Netherland was slowly expanding. In 1631, Minuit returned to Europe. After his departure, conflict with neighboring English colonists and Native American tribes increased. And the swell of violence, corruption, and chaos threatened Dutch control of the region. Then, Dutch Director General Peter Stuyvesant arrived in 1647. Stuyvesant was the ideal man for the job. He was fearless, strong-willed, and disciplined. No one questioned his toughness. A couple years earlier, his leg had been blown off by a cannonball. He was now left with a peg leg, which only added to his intimidating appearance. He was determined to bring order to New Amsterdam and the region. He regulated the taverns and clamped down on smuggling. How many that of my soul say. He also forced residents to attend church every Sunday. He tried to mend relations with the Native Americans by insisting that Indians be paid fairly for their services. It was not a popular policy at the time. Stuyvesant established housing standards, developed a market, and began funding public schools. He once said, "I shall govern you as a father his children." Though many resisted his rigid laws, he was able to do what Minuit couldn't: establish order and create a region both profitable and heavily populated. But the colony's success only made it more tempting to other nations. After 40 years of Dutch rule, the colony fell to the English. When the Duke of York was granted territory in America, including New Netherland, by his brother, King Charles of England, he set out with a small fleet of ships. Without forces to defend the region, General Stuyvesant surrendered to the English without a single shot being fired. In September 1664, New Netherland became New York, named after the Duke of York. The English would rule New York until they were finally pushed out in 1776, when residents declared their independence from England. While the name has changed, you can still see the early Dutch influence throughout New York City. For example, the stockade wall that the Dutch built later became Wall Street. Harlem and Brooklyn are named after towns in the Netherlands. Dutch farms called Boweries became the Bowery. And the Bronx was named after Dutch settler Jonas Bronk. What started out as a colony of 30 Dutch colonists in 1624 has grown into a global icon of over 8 million people. New York City.
Now, one of my favorite colonies to talk about is yet another that practiced peaceful coexistence, maybe to the nth degree, and that was the colony of Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, a group of Quakers. Now, the Quakers are a Christian denomination also known as the Society of Friends, and so they wanted to found their own colony. But like the Dutch, they didn't care who lived there. They're the Society of Friends. They're friendly people. And so they allowed whoever wanted to come live and help them. It's like, oh, hey, you're from the Iroquois tribe. Awesome. Let's put you to work. Hey, you're from where? Italy? That's interesting. Come on in. Sure. And so everyone worked together. Everyone cooperated. Oh, hey, it's Tanner. He believes in the flying spaghetti monster. Really? Okay. That's cool. Yay, fly. You got the banner on your house. All right, cool. You know, hey, whatever. We're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. We believe in peaceful toleration. Oh, man, Luke, did you have to kill Jared's dog? That's not cool. Like, that's really, I know his dog was pooping on your yard, but you did you have to do that? We're pacifist here. We don't fight. We don't do violent things. We're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. Every adult male, no matter who you are or where you came from, got 50 acres of land and got the right to vote. And all decisions affecting the community would be voted on at an assembly where representatives chosen by election would appear and decide. And one of the major tenets of their community was the freedom of religion. Tanner's flying spaghetti monster flag. Well, guys, it's going to stay up. I know that bothers Anna Lee. But you know what? Anna Lee's got to move past that because flying spaghetti monster flag, that's just important to Tanner. And so that's okay. We're going to live with that because we're Quakers. We're the Society of Friends. Now, guess what? Of all the colonists that we've had so far, guess who was the best friends with the natives? The Quakers. Everybody loves the Quakers. I mean, they made my cereal this morning. I love these guys, right? Yeah, the Quaker Oats, still important company. They were very friendly with the natives. Like Rhode Island, the folks of Pennsylvania believed in paying fair value for their land. trade with the natives was regulated to promote fairness. For example, if the natives had a legal claim to a various piece of land for hunting purposes, and they declared that it was not appropriate for Angel to hunt deer on their land, well, if Angel killed a deer on their land, he's got to pay him a fine. By law, that Iroquois tribesman brought Angel to court. Sorry, he's got a tag on that deer. It obviously came from that piece of land. You knew better than to hunt there. I don't know what they told you up in Massachusetts Bay, where God gave you all the land belonging to everyone in the world, but that's not how we do business here. We're Quakers. So trade was regulated. And there was a court to settle differences, because inevitably Luke's going to kill Jared's dog or vice versa, and those bad things are going to happen. We're not going to assume everybody's perfect. And so there's got to be a court to settle differences. But here's the thing, if you treat people fairly and you treat them with respect and decency, 50 years of no violent conflict. Guys, that's like the world record of nicest colony ever. I'm just telling you, it doesn't get any better than that. It really doesn't.
It is not clear how many settlers are enticed to Pennsylvania by Thomas's description. But for Quaker families, the religious freedom the colony offers is reason enough to come.
Those who came to the middle colonies, the Quakers, came with a very distinct set of values which set them off from the Puritans. Two just mentioned the most important. Their much greater regard for gender equality. Women were welcomed as spreaders of the Quaker faith, where Anne Hutchinson was banished from Boston for deigning to be a preacher.
Quaker women travel as what are called public friends. I suppose that our closest synonym for that would be missionaries. To folks like the Puritans, it was absolutely scandalous that women would be allowed to have this measure of public authority. Of course, it didn't stop the Puritans when female Quaker preachers were in the neighborhood from gathering in droves to see the spectacle the same way that they would have gone to see, I suppose, a trained dog or a waxworks. It really did have that sort of fascination for them, but tinged, of course, with a real horror that the Quakers would let women parade themselves around in public in this way and be so assertive.
What made this Middle Atlantic colony so distinctive is the pacifism of the Quaker settlers.
They would not lift a hand violently, and they would not shoulder a gun. Even when attacked, they did not believe in killing. And how it mattered dramatically in the way Indian-white relations proceeded. The Quakers arrived in the middle of a bloodbath. War with Indians to the north, war to the south, war up and down the East Coast, even in New Mexico in 1680. Huge revolt of the Pueblo against the Spanish. But in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, no blood was shed for 70 years or more until the Quakers lost control of their own government.
So there's a real interest in Indian culture on the part of the Quakers, and also a real commitment to fairness in dealing with the Indians. Now, this does not last. In fact, as soon as the waves of Scots-Irish immigration and German immigration begin to sweep into Pennsylvania at the beginning of the 18th century, expansion onto the frontier, white land hunger, overwhelms this much more benign past.
Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the Quakers to the nation that is to become, as well as to Pennsylvania, is religious toleration.
Today, of course, we take it for granted that religious toleration is a great thing, and that one of the things that the government should do is uphold toleration. Assumptions in the 17th century were very different. Once you get into New England, anywhere but Rhode Island, religious toleration is held to be a terrible idea. Why, if you tolerate all different kinds of religion, you open the door for error, the Puritans would say. And so it's really the business of the state to prosecute religious dissidents, to punish them if they can't be driven out.
to worship God the way that God has commanded. That's really why they're there. And they disagree enough that you get these separate colonies. The Connecticut people say, well, we don't like quite what you're doing in Massachusetts, so they try a variant of it. And New Haven tries the most severe variant of it. And then everybody they really can't get along with, they flush down to Rhode Island.
That you are banished from out of our jurisdiction as being a woman.
So, you do have this range of experiments, very different sorts of colonies, and including at least one that was founded mostly for the fur trade. That's New Netherland, which becomes New York.
Now, of course, the practical benefit of encouraging religious toleration for the Quakers is that it makes it very easy to populate your colony if you're willing to take all comers. And so the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, the German Lutherans, and a variety of other smaller religious sects are drawn to Pennsylvania.
A lot of people have tried to see in the Middle Colonies the seeds of what America would become. The Middle Colonies were neither fully north nor south, they were the middle ground. The Middle Colonies were the melting pot where there was greater diversity of all kinds, and that this somehow foreshadowed the pluralist society of 20th century United States. And they are also very dynamic economically, and you see a lot of early moves toward what we would later think of as early industrialization. So all these people pouring in meant that the construction trades had to grow. They relied heavily on a lot of immigrant labor, some of them indentured servants who would take up the work in mines and in construction trades. I think the main thing to say about the Middle Colonies would be its diversity in ethnic and economic and religious terms, as well as its dynamism.
Guess what? It also works economically. Like the Dutch, when you focus on business rather than conflict, things will work out for you. But here's where things get complicated. We also know there's a problem with being too nice. There is. If you become the doormat, well, what happens? People walk over you. And unfortunately, George Washington once said the best way to promote the peace is to be prepared for war. And even though it feels weird saying that, sometimes, I have to admit, he's got a point. Because, in Pennsylvania, they said, whoever, come on in. And thousands of German immigrants, my ancestors, started coming into Pennsylvania. And eventually, the Quakers were outnumbered by these other folks who felt far differently. Their religious toleration extended to the German Protestant way of thinking, to say that God's given them the land, everything, and then before you know it, the Pennsylvania was just like everything else. Slavery was introduced, and they started fighting the natives. Well, by 1752, there were 13 British colonies in North America. Maryland was founded by a Catholic lord named Baltimore, now Baltimore, Maryland. James Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia as a debtor's colony, meaning that if you owed tons and tons of money back in England, they would throw you in prison and work until you paid off your debt. And so Manny owes just a ton of money back in England. Sorry, Manny, that's the breaks. Well, he owes all this money. He's sitting in prison, and he hears rumors that there's a place in Georgia that he can go, and that Oglethorpe will pay his way, and his debt will be forgiven. So he goes, hey, that's better than prison, right? And then he gets there and he realizes it's not that much better than prison, because his job is to exist between the Seminole Indians and the wealthy plantations of South Carolina, and his job is to basically get raided first. They're just a buffer. They are literally there so that the natives have to attack them instead of attacking the plantations. So welcome to Georgia, Manny. Here's your rifle. Good luck. Don't get scalped.